What is the profession called the oldest in the world? And why has it survived all eras, despite the dangers and moral condemnation? This question is not just a provocation. It is a key to understanding the most complex aspects of human civilization. It is a topic that has roots in the very origins of society, where religion, power, economy, and the deeply personal stories of millions of people are intertwined. Today we will embark on an incredibly deep and extensive journey called the Dark Veil of Desire. It will be a journey through the hidden, scandalous, and, unfortunately, often tragic history of courtesans and prostitution, which has existed and evolved over millennia. From ancient rituals in the temples of the Middle East to the complex, multifaceted realities of modern megacities, our goal is not to glorify prostitution, but on the contrary, to reveal it as a historical phenomenon, to show its role in society, its social consequences, and, above all, the incredible dangers and suffering faced by those who find themselves in it. We will see that behind the tinsel of romance created by literature and art, there has always been a harsh and brutal truth. This video will tell how this profession originated, who these women and men were, why they made such a choice, how they were treated in different eras, and most importantly, what deep and often painful lessons we can learn from this comprehensive history. It will be a fascinating and, I hope, very informative narrative, full of intrigue, tragedies, surprising coincidences, and unexpected facts that will make you think. We will begin our grand journey in the cradle of civilization, ancient rituals, then pass through the dark and strict laws of medieval cities, stop in the luxurious salons of courtesans of the Renaissance, delve into the abyss of social problems of the 19th century, and finally, get to the complex and confusing realities of our 21st century. This will be a complete and comprehensive study. But before we begin our long journey, please subscribe to the channel and give us a like. This way, you will support our work and not miss anything interesting. Our journey begins in the ancient world, where, as is believed, the oldest profession originated. We find its first traces in Mesopotamia, around the 3rd millennium BC. In those days, prostitution was closely associated with religion, which creates a completely different picture for us than the one we are used to. In Sumer, and later in Babylon, there was a cult of the goddess Inanna, the patroness of love and fertility. In her temples served the so-called priestesses of love, Naditu and Entu. They were not ordinary prostitutes in our understanding. Naditu, for example, were women from the upper strata of society who lived in temple complexes and, although they did not marry, could have intimate relationships. This was part of their sacred service, and society treated them with great respect. Their role was, rather, ritual and symbolic. However, besides them, there were other priestesses, for example Kadishtu, whose connection with the temples was more direct and who could provide intimate services for a fee. These practices were part of fertility rituals, which were believed to ensure a harvest and the prosperity of the entire kingdom. It is in these ancient texts that we find the first legislative acts regulating the lives of harlots. The famous Code of Hammurabi already mentions rules regarding the rights and duties of women who engaged in this craft, which indicates that this practice was widespread and had long ceased to be exclusively ritual. In ancient Egypt, the situation was similar. The cult of the goddess Hathor, the patroness of love, music, and dance, was also associated with certain forms of prostitution. The priestesses who served in her temples sometimes provided intimate services, but this carried a hint of a sacred ritual. However, as in Mesopotamia, there was also street prostitution, which had no connection to religion. These women were usually slaves or poor women who sold their bodies to survive. The social perception of them was completely different. They did not have high status and lived in poverty. Even then, society drew a clear line between sacred, ritual prostitution, which was part of religion and was perceived as something sublime, and ordinary, commercial prostitution, which was considered a vice and the lot of the lower classes. In ancient Greece, we see how prostitution became more structured and commercial, moving away from its religious roots. Here, there were several categories. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were the pornai, ordinary street prostitutes who served anyone who wanted their services. Their lives were full of danger, poverty, and humiliation. Above them were the olatrides, dancers and flute players who often provided their services at private feasts. And finally, at the very top were the hetairai. They were not just prostitutes. They were women with brilliant education, refined manners, and broad horizons. They could converse about philosophy, art, and politics, and that is why they were the companions of the most influential men of their time. Philosophers, politicians, and military leaders. Famous hetairai, such as Aspasia, the mistress of the Athenian leader Pericles, or Phryne, whose beauty inspired great sculptors, had a huge influence on culture and politics. Unlike married Athenian women who led a secluded life, hetairai were the only women who had access to public and intellectual life. They, however, were not free. Their lives depended on their patrons, and their status always remained precarious. Ancient Rome took prostitution to a completely new, truly industrial level. The Romans did not condemn prostitution as such, but considered it a part of a man's life. The services of prostitutes were available to all social classes, from slaves to senators. In Rome, there were lupanaria, huge brothels that were carefully organized and regulated by the state. Some of them have been preserved to this day, for example, in Pompeii. We can see the rooms where the women worked, and even drawings on the walls that served as advertising. Prostitutes, who were called meretrices or prostituti, were required to wear distinctive clothing and pay taxes. Their names and prices were often written on the walls. The lives of Roman prostitutes were difficult and without rights. They were at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, had no civil rights, and were branded with the word infamia, which meant the loss of honor and dignity. Their lives, as a rule, were short, filled with disease and violence. Thus, already in the ancient world, we see that despite the romanticization of the image of priestesses or hetairai, the real lives of most women engaged in prostitution were full of dangers, exploitation, and poverty. It was a hierarchical society in which a woman's status was determined by her income and connections. But even at the very top, this power was illusory. With the fall of the Roman Empire and the spread of Christianity in Europe, attitudes towards prostitution changed dramatically. The Church, which proclaimed chastity as one of the main virtues, declared prostitution a mortal sin, and the women who engaged in it were called fallen women. Prostitutes became outcasts, objects of contempt and condemnation. They were expelled from cities, branded, and forced to wear shameful signs. It would seem that in the Christian world, this phenomenon should have had no place. But history again shows us a surprising paradox. Influential theologians, such as Augustine of Hippo and later Thomas Aquinas, concluded that prostitution, despite its sinfulness, is a necessary evil. Thomas Aquinas, for example, compared it to a sewer in a palace, unpleasant, but necessary to maintain cleanliness. It was believed that prostitution prevents a greater sin, violence against virtuous women and sodomy. This pragmatic position became the basis for the authorities not only not to eradicate prostitution, but also to begin regulating it. In the rapidly growing cities of medieval Europe, such as Paris, London, and Florence, officially permitted and regulated brothels, or stews, began to appear. The city authorities realized that prostitution could not be eradicated, but could be controlled and taxed. They imposed special taxes on brothels, set rules, determined where these establishments could be located, and even specified what clothing prostitutes should wear to be easily distinguished from respectable women. For example, in some cities, they had to wear special yellow or red ribbons on their clothes. This was a brand that made them stand out even more from society. The lives of prostitutes in the Middle Ages were incredibly difficult and short. Who became them? These were the most vulnerable women. Peasant women who could not find work in the city, widows who were left without means, orphan girls, slaves. They simply had no other choice. They lived in appalling conditions, were deprived of all rights, and were under the complete control of brothel owners and pimps. Dangers were everywhere. Violence from clients, diseases, and from the late 15th century, the terrible syphilis epidemic, which, according to some reports, came to Europe after the return of Columbus's sailors from America. This disease, which was practically incurable at the time, brought immeasurable suffering and death. But here, too, we cannot do without cultural differences. In Byzantium, for example, prostitution was common in the luxurious quarters of Constantinople, where wealthy merchants and officials spent huge sums on entertainment. At the same time, in Japan, there were geishas and oiran. It is important to understand that a geisha is an artist who entertains her clients with singing, dancing, playing musical instruments, and conducting clever conversations. She did not sell her body. On the contrary, the oiran were high-ranking courtesans who lived in special pleasure quarters and had refined manners. Their status was very high, but in essence, they were a part of the prostitution system. In China, there were the so-called flower boats and flower girls, educated and talented women who entertained men. In the Islamic world, prostitution was strictly condemned, but there were practices such as muta, temporary marriages that allowed men to legally have intimate relations with women for a certain period for a fee. Thus, we see that in different cultures, prostitution took different forms, but its essence, the exploitation of women, remained unchanged. The Renaissance and the modern age brought with them the flourishing of courtesans. These were women who were at the very top of their profession. They were not just prostitutes. They were educated, refined, talented, and influential. Courtesans, as a rule, were patrons of the arts, held their own salons where the most influential people of their time, artists, writers, politicians, gathered. They were advisors to kings and patrons. In Venice, for example, Veronica Franco flourished, a poet who actively corresponded with influential men, defending her views. Her poetry has survived to this day, which makes her one of the most famous women of the era. Other famous courtesans, such as Tullia d'Aragona, were so educated that they held philosophical conversations with the most famous minds of their time. Their influence on politics and culture was enormous. They were trendsetters, and their salons were centers of cultural life. However, this golden age of courtesans was only a thin layer at the very top. Underneath it was a huge mass of street prostitutes, whose lives remained the same as in the Middle Ages. While courtesans lived in luxury, thousands of women struggled to survive in the dirty and dangerous backstreets of London, Paris, and Amsterdam. It was during this period that the authorities, realizing that syphilis had become a real epidemic, began to introduce stricter laws, trying to regulate prostitution and forcing women to undergo medical examinations. This was not so much a concern for the health of the women themselves as it was an attempt to protect their clients. The image of a prostitute during this time deeply penetrated literature and art. In the paintings of Titian, Rubens, and Goya, we see female bodies that, although depicted with artistic refinement, often hint at accessibility. In literature, from Boccaccio's Decameron to the works of Cervantes and Shakespeare, prostitution became an important theme, reflecting human passions and vices. However, behind all this external gloss and romanticization lay real tragedies. The lives of most women were short, full of violence and dependencies. They could be completely dependent on their patrons, and at any moment, they could be abandoned. A striking example is the tragic fate of Marion Delorme, a famous French courtesan who died in poverty. Thus, the Renaissance, despite its outward beauty, showed us the double standards of society. On one pole were the luxurious and educated courtesans, and on the other were the poor and disenfranchised women whom society used and rejected. The 19th century became a time when prostitution took on an incredible scale. The Industrial Revolution led to the mass migration of people from villages to cities. Cities grew, but they could not cope with the huge flow of poor people. The terrible living conditions in factory areas, low wages, and a lack of social protection drove many women to extreme measures. Prostitution became not just a social phenomenon, but a huge industry, a mirror of all the social problems of that time. In London, Paris, Berlin, and other European cities, there were entire quarters where prostitution was the only way for thousands of women to survive. Governments, trying to cope with the growing problem, began to introduce stricter laws. In England, the infamous Contagious Diseases Acts were passed. Under these laws, the police had the right to arrest any woman suspected of prostitution and force her to undergo compulsory medical examinations. If she was found to have a venereal disease, she was sent to special hospitals, where she could be held for years. These laws were extremely unfair, as they applied only to women and did not affect their clients. This discrimination caused a wave of protests. Josephine Butler, an English feminist and activist, led a movement against these laws, arguing that they violated women's rights and were a form of legalized violence. Thanks to her efforts and the efforts of many others, these laws were eventually repealed. In 19th century art and literature, prostitution became one of the central themes. On the one hand, there was a romantic image created by works such as The Lady of the Camellias by Alexandre Dumas Fils, which showed a tragic but noble courtesan. This story inspired Verdi to create the opera La Traviata. On the other hand, there were realist writers, such as Émile Zola, who in their works showed all the cruelty and dirt of the lives of prostitutes without embellishment. In the press of that time, the problem of white slavery was actively discussed. When young women were lured or forced into brothels and forced to engage in prostitution. In colonial empires, prostitution also flourished. In British India, for example, there were entire quarters where women, the so-called tawaifs, provided services to British soldiers and officers. In America, in the Wild West, prostitutes were an integral part of the life of settlements. And in New Orleans, there was the famous Storyville Quarter, where prostitution was completely legalized and regulated. However, despite the external legality, the lives of these women were full of dangers. Thus, the 19th century showed us that prostitution is not just a phenomenon, but a deep social problem associated with inequality, exploitation, and injustice that has spread throughout the world. The 20th century brought with it wars and revolutions, and prostitution, as always, was at the center of these events. Both world wars led to an increase in prostitution, as women who had lost their husbands or found themselves in poverty looked for a way to survive. During World War II, one of the most terrible tragedies in the history of prostitution occurred. The story of the so-called comfort women in Japan. Thousands of women, mostly from Korea and China, were forcibly subjected to sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers. This tragedy is still one of the most painful topics in the history of the 20th century and serves as a prime example of how prostitution can be used as an instrument of violence and exploitation. In the Soviet Union, prostitution was officially banned. The authorities considered it a relic of the capitalist past and social parasitism. Prostitutes were sent for re-education, to prisons, or to labor camps. However, as is often the case, a complete ban did not lead to its disappearance. Prostitution went underground, becoming even more dangerous and criminalized. In other countries, on the contrary, the first discussions about legalization began. For example, in the Netherlands and Germany, the authorities began to conclude that a complete ban on prostitution makes women even more vulnerable, and that its regulation is the only way to ensure their safety, health, and tax collection. This approach, however, caused heated debate. Feminist organizations were divided. Some believed that legalization is a recognition of prostitution as a normal job, which, in their opinion, legalizes exploitation, while others argued that legalization gives women more rights and protects them from violence. In the 20th century, humanity faced a new global threat: HIV/AIDS. This epidemic became one of the most terrible challenges for prostitution, as women working in this field were especially vulnerable. It was then that the first aid programs arose, which began to disseminate information about safe sex, provide medical care, and try to help women find another path. Hollywood also did not stand aside. Films such as Pretty Woman romanticized the image of a prostitute, showing a story of love and salvation, while more realistic dramas, such as Midnight Cowboy, tried to show the cruel and ruthless side of this world. In general, the 20th century was a century of change, when prostitution became the object not only of condemnation, but also of deep social and political debate. In the 21st century, prostitution is one of the most complex and controversial social problems that has a global scale. Different countries take different approaches to solving it. There are three main models: legalization, criminalization, and abolitionism. In countries such as Germany and the Netherlands, prostitution is legalized. It is believed that this helps to control the industry, combat human trafficking, ensure the safety and health of women, and collect taxes. However, critics of this model point out that legalization has not led to the disappearance of illegal prostitution, but, on the contrary, has made it more attractive to human traffickers. In Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, the so-called Swedish model, or abolitionism, is applied. It consists in the fact that prostitution is not considered a normal job, but is a form of violence and exploitation. Therefore, not the prostitutes are punished, but their clients and pimps. This model is based on the idea that prostitution exists because of demand, and if you destroy the demand, the supply will also disappear. Proponents of this model argue that it is the most effective way to combat human trafficking. In countries where prostitution is completely criminalized, it goes underground, which makes women even more vulnerable and disenfranchised. The lack of legal protection and control by the state leads to an increase in violence and the spread of diseases. One of the most terrible aspects of modern prostitution is human trafficking. This is modern slavery, when young women and children are abducted or lured into this sphere by deception. According to international organizations, the scale of this tragedy is staggering, and many countries are actively fighting this problem. But it, unfortunately, remains one of the most terrible in the world. Technology has also made its changes. The internet has become a new platform for prostitution. Online platforms, the webcam industry, and sites such as OnlyFans have appeared, which allow people to earn money by selling intimate content. This has given some people more control over their work, but it has also created new risks: cybercrime, blackmail, the spread of personal information, and anonymity, which makes criminals more elusive. In the 21st century, heated debates about prostitution continue in feminist circles. Some feminists believe that prostitution is a form of exploitation and violence, and that no woman can choose it voluntarily. They call for a complete ban. Others, the so-called sex-positive feminists, argue that it is a woman's personal choice, and that women have the right to dispose of their bodies, and that the state should provide them with legal protection. The history of prostitution is not just a chronicle of one of the oldest professions. It is a mirror that reflects the entire history of humanity. Its passions and weaknesses, its inequality and cruelty, its desire for control and the struggle for freedom. Prostitution has existed for millennia and, unfortunately, continues to exist in our world. Why does it remain a part of society? The reasons are deep and complex. It is poverty that drives people to extreme measures. It is inequality that deprives people of choice. It is power that has always sought to control and use human desires. The stories of women and men involved in this sphere deserve sympathy and understanding, not condemnation. These are stories full of tragedies, suffering, and broken lives. It is important to remember that behind every courtesan, behind every prostitute, behind every person who finds themselves in this sphere, there are real people who are often victims of circumstances and exploitation. Their lives, despite all the external romance or glamour, are often full of pain and humiliation. In the end, prostitution is not romance, but a complex social problem that shows us the darkest sides of human nature. It is associated with inequality, violence, and human trafficking. This story should make us think about how society can help those who are in the most vulnerable situation, and how we can create a world in which no one will be forced to sell their body to survive. The history of prostitution is a mirror of human passions and mistakes. What lesson will we learn from it today? Write in the comments what surprised you most about this story. and what you think about the problem of prostitution in the modern world. And of course, subscribe to the channel and give us a like so you don't miss other stories.